Sarah Thompson's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the Monroe County Courthouse on a crisp Monday morning. Her navy blue suit was pressed to perfection, and her leather briefcase contained meticulously prepared documents for the housing discrimination case she had taken on pro bono 3 months ago. At 42, Sarah had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the state's most respected civil rights attorneys. Her office walls held degrees from Howard University and Yale Law School, though today, those credentials seemed to carry little weight in Judge William Harrison's courtroom. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the usual morning activity, lawyers hurrying past with coffee cups, nervous defendants waiting with their attorneys, and court officers directing traffic through the metal detectors. Sarah nodded at familiar faces as she made her way to courtroom 4B, where her client, Mrs. Jenkins, was already waiting. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah said warmly, setting her briefcase down. The elderly woman, dressed in her Sunday best, wrung her hands nervously. At 73, Mrs. Jenkins had faced housing discrimination when trying to rent an apartment in an upscale neighborhood. The property manager had suddenly claimed the unit was no longer available after meeting her in person, only to rent it to a younger white couple 2 days later. "Miss Thompson, I'm so nervous," Mrs. Jenkins whispered. "I'd never been in a courtroom before." Sarah squeezed the woman's hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, we have a solid case, and justice is on our side. The law is clear about housing discrimination." As other attorneys and spectators filed into the courtroom, Sarah noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere when Judge Harrison entered through his chamber doors. At 65, he was known for his rigid demeanor and traditional views. His reputation among minority attorneys was particularly troubling, though no one had ever formally complained. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Court of Monroe County is now in session, the Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding." Sarah stood, her spine straight and shoulders back, as Judge Harrison settled into his chair. His steel-gray eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering a moment too long on Sarah and her client. The slight curl of his lip didn't go unnoticed. "Case number 2025 CV 4872, Jenkins v. Parkview Properties," the clerk announced. Sarah stepped forward. "Sarah Thompson, representing the plaintiff, Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, Your Honor." Judge Harrison peered down at her over his reading glasses. "Miss Thompson, is it? I don't believe I've seen you in my courtroom before." "That's correct, Your Honor. Though I've practiced law in this state for 15 years, this is my first case before your bench." The judge's response came with a dismissive wave. "Well, I run a tight ship here. I expect attorneys to be thoroughly prepared and familiar with proper courtroom procedure." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Several attorneys present exchanged knowing glances, while the court reporter's fingers paused briefly over her keyboard. "Of course, Your Honor," Sarah replied evenly. "I prepared a comprehensive brief outlining the clear violations of the Fair Housing Act in this case." As she began presenting her opening arguments, Judge Harrison interrupted her 3 times within the first 5 minutes. Each interruption seemed designed to throw her off balance, questioning basic legal principles that any first-year law student would know. "Miss Thompson," he cut in again, "are you certain you're citing the correct precedent? That seems rather ambitious for this type of case." Sarah maintained her composure, though she felt Mrs. Jenkins tense beside her. "Yes, Your Honor. The precedent established in Williams v. Matthews Company directly applies to our situation. The Supreme Court was quite clear on this matter." Judge Harrison muttered, making a show of shuffling through his papers. "We'll see about that. Continue." The morning proceeded with similar interruptions, each more pointed than the last. Sarah noticed the defense attorney, a young white man fresh out of law school, received no such treatment when presenting his arguments. What Judge Harrison didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Sarah Thompson wasn't just another attorney he could dismiss. In her briefcase lay a document that would change the entire dynamic of this case, and possibly the future of the state's judicial system. As the morning session drew to a close, Sarah calmly organized her papers, already planning her next move. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful weapon against prejudice was patience and having an ace up your sleeve. The afternoon session began with Judge Harrison's continued display of thinly veiled contempt. As Sarah prepared to present her evidence, she could feel the tension building in the courtroom like a thunderstorm about to break. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A, documenting the communication between Mrs. Jenkins and Parkview Properties, Sarah stated, her voice steady despite the judge's dismissive expression. Miss Thompson, Judge Harrison interrupted, removing his glasses with exaggerated patience. I hope you understand that this court's time is valuable. We don't need to examine every email and phone call. Sarah stood her ground. With all due respect, Your Honor, these communications establish a clear pattern of. Miss Thompson, he cut in again, his voice sharp. Perhaps in your limited experience, you're not aware of how things work in my courtroom. I suggest you focus on actual evidence rather than hearsay. The defense attorney, Mark Wilson, smirked from his table. He hadn't needed to do much work. Judge Harrison was practically arguing his case for him. Sarah felt Mrs. Jenkins trembling beside her. The elderly woman's eyes were fixed on her clasped hands, her dignity under assault not just by the original discrimination, but now by the very system meant to protect her. Your Honor. Sarah began again, her tone professional but firm. The Supreme Court has established that circumstantial evidence is just as valid as direct evidence in discrimination cases. The documentation I'm presenting shows that Mrs. Jenkins was told the apartment was available at 10 a.m., but after meeting her in person at 2 p.m., she was informed it had been rented. However, the unit remained listed as available for 3 more days. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his face reddening. Ms. Thompson, are you attempting to lecture me on the law? No, Your Honor. I'm simply presenting the facts of our case. The facts as you see them, he corrected with a condescending smile. I've been on this bench for 25 years. I think I know how to identify legitimate discrimination from, shall we say, perceived slights. Several spectators in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of the increasingly tense exchange. Your Honor. Sarah responded, maintaining her composure. The facts are quite clear. We have documentation showing that immediately after rejecting Mrs. Jenkins, Parkview Properties rented the same unit to a young white couple with lower income and worse credit scores. Objection, Your Honor. Mark Wilson finally spoke up. Counsel is making assumptions about our client's motivations. Sustained, Judge Harrison declared before Sarah could even respond. Miss Thompson, I'm beginning to wonder if you're out of your depth here. Perhaps you should stick to simpler cases. The courtroom fell silent. Even Wilson looked uncomfortable now, aware that the judge had crossed a line. Sarah straightened her spine, her voice clear and controlled. Your Honor, are you suggesting that my capabilities as an attorney are somehow diminished because of my race or gender? Judge Harrison's face flushed darker. I'm suggesting that your inexperience is showing, Miss Thompson. Don't try to make this something it's not. Then perhaps, Your Honor, you'd be interested in reviewing my credentials. Sarah reached for her briefcase. I have here a document that might help establish my qualifications to practice in your courtroom. Miss Thompson, I don't need to see your law school diploma. Judge Harrison scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Oh, this isn't my diploma, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice steady. But I believe it's relevant to these proceedings. Would you like me to enter it into evidence? Judge Harrison sighed heavily. If you insist on wasting the court's time. Sarah nodded to her assistant, who approached the bench with a sealed envelope. As the judge's clerk handed it to him, Sarah noticed the slight tremor in Judge Harrison's hands as he opened it. The afternoon sun streamed through the high courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In the gallery, people leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Mrs. Jenkins looked up at Sarah with questioning eyes, but Sarah kept her gaze fixed on Judge Harrison as he began to read the document. The color drained from his face as his eyes moved across the page, and for the first time that day, Judge William Harrison was completely silent. Judge Harrison stared at the document in his hands, his previous arrogance replaced by a dawning realization. The paper he held wasn't just any credential. It was Sarah Thompson's official appointment letter as the incoming State Bar Association president and chair of the Judicial Conduct Review Board. I trust this helps establish my qualifications, Your Honor. Sarah's voice cut through the thick silence. Now, shall we continue with Mrs. Jenkins' case? The courtroom had become so quiet that the gentle whir of the air conditioning seemed deafening. The defense attorney, Mark Wilson, was frantically flipping through his papers, suddenly aware that his easy victory had evaporated. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his robe with nervous hands. "Yes, well, proceed, Ms. Thompson." "Thank you, Your Honor." Sarah turned to address the court reporter. "I'd like the record to reflect the previous exchanges between myself and the court, particularly the comments regarding my capabilities and experience." The judge's face tightened. He knew exactly what she was doing, creating a clear record of his conduct. Every dismissive comment, every interruption, every subtle and not-so-subtle slight was now preserved in the official transcript. "For the record," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, "I'd also like to note that in the past 2 hours, I've been interrupted 17 times while presenting standard legal arguments. My opposing counsel, in contrast, has spoken uninterrupted." Mark Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly feeling like collateral damage in a much larger battle. Mrs. Jenkins watched the proceedings with wide eyes, beginning to understand that her housing discrimination case had become the backdrop for something much more significant. "Ms. Thompson," Judge Harrison attempted to regain control, "let's focus on the case at hand." "Of course, Your Honor. That's been my intention all along." Sarah retrieved another document from her briefcase. "I have here statistics showing a troubling pattern in your courtroom. Over the past 5 years, cases presented by minority attorneys have been dismissed at a rate 3 times higher than those presented by their white colleagues." The gallery erupted in hushed whispers. Judge Harrison's hands gripped the edges of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "These statistics were compiled as part of a routine review by the State Bar Association," Sarah explained, her tone matter-of-fact. "We've been monitoring several concerning trends in judicial conduct across the state." Judge Harrison's face had taken on an ashen color. "Miss Thompson, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular, Your Honor, is the systematic bias that has gone unchecked in this courtroom." Sarah's words were measured but firm. "As the incoming chair of the Judicial Conduct Review Board, I have a duty to address such irregularities." The defense attorney raised his hand tentatively. "Your Honor, given these developments, perhaps we should consider a brief recess." "No," Sarah interjected. "Mrs. Jenkins has waited long enough for justice. I move that we continue with our case, but with the understanding that every decision, every comment, and every ruling will be subject to thorough review." Judge Harrison sat rigid in his chair, trapped by his own previous behavior. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. "Very well," he managed to say, his voice notably subdued. "Continue with your evidence, Ms. Thompson." Sarah nodded and began presenting her case again, this time without interruption. The transformation was striking. Gone were the dismissive comments and condescending tones. Instead, Judge Harrison listened with forced attention, painfully aware that his career might hang in the balance. In the gallery, several young law students who had come to observe court proceedings scribbled notes furiously. They were witnessing more than just a housing discrimination case. They were seeing the moment when long-standing power structures began to crack. Mrs. Jenkins reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand under the table, a gesture of gratitude and understanding. Her case had become a vehicle for addressing not just one instance of discrimination, but a systemic problem that had affected countless others. As the afternoon continued, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic. The day when prejudice in a judge's robe met its match in a black woman who refused to be silenced. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah Thompson was ready for it. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B had transformed dramatically. Judge Harrison now sat stiffly in his chair, watching Sarah present her evidence with the careful attention of a man walking on thin ice. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, pulling out a series of photographs. "These images show the apartment in question being shown to different prospective tenants on the same day Mrs. Jenkins was rejected. The photos clearly showed the property manager, smiling warmly while showing the unit to a young white couple just hours after telling Mrs. Jenkins it was no longer available. Furthermore, Sarah added, placing another document on the evidence table, "We have obtained the rental application submitted by the couple who eventually leased the apartment. As you can see, their combined income was $15,000 less than Mrs. Jenkins' pension, and their credit scores were significantly lower. Judge Harrison nodded slowly, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by rigid formality. The court recognizes this evidence. In the gallery, several attorneys who had faced similar treatment in Harrison's courtroom over the years watched with a mixture of satisfaction and vindication. One of them, James Carter, had lost 3 housing discrimination cases in this very courtroom despite having solid evidence. Your Honor, Mark Wilson stood up, his confidence noticeably deflated. While these documents show a difference in treatment, they don't necessarily prove discriminatory intent. Sarah turned to face the defense attorney. Mr. Wilson, are you familiar with the concept of disparate impact under the Fair Housing Act? Of course, but... Then you're aware that proving discriminatory intent isn't necessary when the evidence shows a clear pattern of disparate impact on protected classes. Wilson glanced nervously at his clients, the Parkview Properties representatives, who sat with tight expressions. Yes, but we maintain that other factors influence the decision. What other factors? Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. Mrs. Jenkins has an impeccable rental history, higher income, and better credit than the approved tenants. What exactly were these other factors? The courtroom fell silent as Wilson struggled to respond. Judge Harrison, who would typically have jumped in to assist the defense, remained unusually quiet. Sarah continued, We've also obtained emails between Parkview Properties management discussing what they called maintaining the community's character. Would you like me to read these emails aloud? The defense team huddled together, whispering urgently. Finally, Wilson stood again. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, we request a brief recess to discuss possible settlement options with our clients. Judge Harrison looked to Sarah, his earlier condescension replaced by careful neutrality. Miss Thompson? A 15-minute recess would be acceptable, Your Honor, Sarah agreed. However, any settlement must address not only Mrs. Jenkins' case, but also establish new anti-discrimination policies and training requirements for all Parkview Properties staff. As the judge announced the recess, Mrs. Jenkins turned to Sarah with tears in her eyes. All these years, she whispered, I've been told I was imagining things, being too sensitive. But you proved it, you showed them the truth. Sarah squeezed her client's hand. This isn't just about getting you that apartment anymore, Mrs. Jenkins. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what you did. During the recess, the courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. Other attorneys approached Sarah, sharing their own experiences with discrimination in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Court clerks and staff members watched from a distance, sensing that they were witnessing a significant shift in the power dynamics they had long taken for granted. Judge Harrison remained in his chambers, likely making urgent phone calls to colleagues and possibly his own attorney. His decades-long reign of unchecked bias was crumbling, and he knew it. Mark Wilson approached Sarah with a settlement offer, his previous smugness replaced by professional courtesy. Ms. Thompson, my clients are prepared to offer substantial compensation and agree to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Sarah reviewed the offer carefully. This is a good start, Mr. Wilson. We'll need independent oversight of the policy implementation. And of course, all of this will be part of the public record. As the recess drew to a close, Sarah gathered her documents, knowing that this case had become about much more than one woman's right to fair housing. It had become a watershed moment, challenging not just the discrimination of one property company, but the systemic bias that had persisted unchecked in the justice system itself. The bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, and Sarah straightened her jacket, ready for the next phase of the battle. After the recess, the courtroom reconvened with a notably different energy. The defense team for Parkview Properties had lost their earlier confidence, and Judge Harrison seemed to have aged years in just 15 minutes. Your Honor, Mark Wilson stood, his voice less assured than before. We would like to present a settlement offer to Ms. Thompson and her client. Proceed, Judge Harrison said quietly, a far cry from his earlier commanding tone. As Wilson outlined the terms of the settlement, Sarah listened carefully while taking notes. The offer included not only substantial financial compensation for Mrs. Jenkins, but also sweeping changes to Parkview Properties' rental policies. The settlement includes $150,000 in damages, Wilson continued, along with mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, quarterly audits of rental applications for the next 5 years, and a written apology to Mrs. Jenkins. Sarah turned to her client. "Mrs. Jenkins, what are your thoughts on these terms?" The elderly woman sat straighter in her chair. "Will this help make sure they don't do this to anyone else?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. The quarterly audits would be conducted by an independent civil rights organization, and the results would be public record. Mrs. Jenkins nodded firmly. "Then I accept." But Sarah wasn't finished. She stood, adjusting her jacket. "While my client accepts these terms, there's still a matter of judicial conduct that needs to be addressed." Judge Harrison's face tightened as Sarah retrieved another document from her briefcase. "Over the past 3 hours in this courtroom," Sarah began, "we've witnessed a pattern of behavior that reflects a larger issue. I am now officially submitting this complaint to the Judicial Conduct Review Board." She handed copies to the court clerk, who looked nervously between her and the judge. The complaint details not only today's interactions but includes sworn statements from 27 attorneys who have experienced similar treatment in this courtroom. It also contains statistical analysis showing systematic bias in rulings against minority attorneys and their clients. The gallery erupted in whispers. Several attorneys present recognized themselves among the 27 who had come forward. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison started, his voice strained, "surely we can discuss this privately." "No, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted firmly. "These issues have persisted in private for far too long. As the incoming chair of the Judicial Conduct Review Board, it's my duty to ensure that justice is truly blind." She turned to address the entire courtroom. "The settlement in Mrs. Jenkins' case is just the beginning. Real change requires acknowledging and addressing systemic bias at every level of our justice system." Judge Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. The weight of his actions, accumulated over years of unchecked authority, was finally catching up to him. "The review board will begin its investigation immediately," Sarah continued. "I will, of course, recuse myself from the direct investigation due to my involvement in today's proceedings, but I will ensure that every complaint is thoroughly examined." The defense team from Parkview Properties watched uncomfortably, realizing their discrimination case had inadvertently exposed a much larger issue. Mrs. Jenkins, who had come to court seeking justice for a denied apartment, now sat witness to a moment of historical significance in the state's judicial system. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady, "I move that we complete the settlement paperwork for Mrs. Jenkins' case, and then I suggest you consider taking a voluntary leave of absence pending the review board's investigation." Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom, seeing not the usual deference he'd come to expect, but a sea of faces awaiting justice. His authority, once absolute in this room, had crumbled in the face of documented truth. He began, then cleared his throat. "I will take your suggestion under advisement, Miss Thompson." As the settlement papers were processed, Sarah noticed several young law students in the gallery taking detailed notes. She hoped they were learning an important lesson, that justice doesn't just happen. Sometimes it needs to be fought for, challenged, and reformed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Sarah gathered her materials. She had come to court today to fight housing discrimination, but she was leaving having sparked a movement for judicial reform. As she helped Mrs. Jenkins with her coat, Sarah knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The system wouldn't change overnight, but today it had marked a significant first step. News of what happened in courtroom 4B spread through the legal community like wildfire. By the next morning, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, attorneys, and civil rights organizations. In her downtown office, Sarah sat reviewing the growing stack of complaints against Judge Harrison. Her assistant, Lisa, knocked on the door with yet another pile of documents. "These just came in," Lisa said, placing them on the desk. 5 more attorneys have come forward with documented cases of discrimination in Harrison's courtroom, and the State Bar Association's emergency meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. Sarah nodded, studying a particularly troubling case where a Hispanic attorney had been held in contempt for speaking too quietly, while his white colleague had been praised for his presentation in the same hearing. "The pattern is undeniable," Sarah murmured, making notes in her legal pad. Her office walls, lined with law books and achievements, now seemed to hold a greater purpose. The local news channels had picked up the story. On the TV mounted in her office corner, a reporter stood outside the courthouse. Sources say Judge William Harrison has taken an immediate leave of absence following allegations of systematic discrimination. This comes after a dramatic confrontation with prominent attorney Sarah Thompson, who has recently been appointed as chair of the Judicial Conduct Review Board. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Mrs. Jenkins. The settlement check had arrived, along with the formal apology from Parkview Properties. But more importantly, 3 other residents had contacted Mrs. Jenkins with similar stories of discrimination. "Lisa," Sarah called out, "get me the contact information for those 3 residents Mrs. Jenkins mentioned. This might be bigger than just one property company." As she worked, more attorneys began arriving at her office, each carrying their own documentation of questionable rulings and biased treatment from Judge Harrison's courtroom. The conference room soon filled with legal professionals of various backgrounds, all sharing similar experiences. James Carter, the attorney who had lost 3 housing discrimination cases in Harrison's court, spread his case files across the conference table. "Looking back, the pattern is so clear. How did we let this go on for so long?" "Fear," another attorney, Maria Rodriguez, answered. "Fear of retaliation, fear of being blacklisted, fear of losing our credibility. But that stops now." Sarah stood at the head of the conference table, surveying the group of determined faces. "What we're doing isn't just about Harrison. It's about examining the entire system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from State Supreme Court Justice Eleanor Martinez. She arrived without fanfare, requesting a private meeting with Sarah. "Ms. Thompson," Justice Martinez began once they were alone in Sarah's office, "what you've uncovered is disturbing, but unfortunately not unique. We've had concerns about similar situations in other districts." Sarah leaned forward. "Then perhaps it's time for a comprehensive review of judicial conduct across the state." Justice Martinez nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I'm here. The Supreme Court is forming a special committee to examine bias in our judicial system. We'd like you to lead it." Outside Sarah's office, the group of attorneys continued their work, organizing evidence and documenting patterns. The story had moved beyond one racist judge. It had become about transforming a system that had protected such behavior for far too long. By evening, Sarah's office had become an impromptu command center for judicial reform. Laptops glowed in the dimming light as attorneys worked late into the night, their commitment fueled by years of pent-up frustration and the sudden hope for change. Mrs. Jenkins stopped by with dinner for everyone, her simple act of kindness reminding them all of why this fight mattered. "You know," she said while setting out containers of home-cooked food, "I just wanted to rent an apartment. I never thought I'd end up being part of something this important." Sarah smiled, watching the diverse group of legal professionals working together. "Sometimes," she replied, "the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of injustice." As the city lights began twinkling outside her office windows, Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. Judge Harrison's case had cracked open a door that had been sealed for too long, and through that door, the light of justice was finally beginning to shine. 1 week after the confrontation in Courtroom 4B, the State Bar Association convened an emergency session. The Grand Meeting Hall was packed with attorneys, judges, and media representatives, all waiting to hear the findings of the preliminary investigation into Judge Harrison's conduct. Sarah sat at the main table, surrounded by stacks of evidence collected over the past week. The investigation had revealed far more than anyone had anticipated. Behind her sat Mrs. Jenkins, who had become something of a symbol for the movement, along with dozens of other individuals who had faced discrimination in Harrison's courtroom. "The evidence before us today," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the hushed room, "reveals a pattern of judicial misconduct spanning more than 2 decades. She gestured to the screens behind her, where graphs and statistics painted a damning picture. In cases involving minority attorneys, Judge Harrison's dismissal rate was 78% higher than the state average. In cases involving minority plaintiffs, damages awarded were consistently 45% lower than similar cases with white plaintiffs." The room filled with murmurs as the numbers sank in. Judge Harrison, who had been required to attend, sat in the back row, his face ashen as his legacy unraveled before him. "But perhaps most disturbing," Sarah continued, is the discovery of private communications between Judge Harrison and certain law firms, suggesting preferential treatment based on race and gender. A series of emails appeared on the screen, each more damaging than the last. One particularly shocking message showed Harrison advising a law firm to assign only white male attorneys to his courtroom for the best results. State Supreme Court Justice Martinez, who had been observing the proceedings, stood up. "Ms. Thompson, given the severity of these findings, what actions do you recommend?" Sarah straightened her shoulders. "The Judicial Conduct Review Board recommends immediate suspension of Judge Harrison's judicial powers, pending a full investigation. Additionally, we propose a review of all cases handled by Judge Harrison over the past 5 years, with priority given to cases involving minority attorneys and plaintiffs." The room erupted in discussion. Several older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps wondering if their own conduct would soon face similar scrutiny. Furthermore, Sarah added, silencing the room, "We're establishing a new oversight committee to review judicial conduct across all districts. This committee will include representatives from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, ensuring diverse perspectives in monitoring our justice system." From his seat, Judge Harrison finally spoke up, his voice lacking its former authority. "This is a witch hunt. You're destroying a 25-year career over a few misunderstandings." Sarah turned to face him directly. "No, Your Honor. You destroyed your career through years of documented discrimination. We're simply bringing it to light." Justice Martinez stood again. "I move to accept all recommendations from the review board. We cannot claim to serve justice while allowing such bias to persist in our courtrooms." The vote was nearly unanimous. Only a few old guard judges abstained, their abstentions noted for future reference. As the session concluded, reporters rushed to get statements. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered: law students, community activists, and citizens who had faced discrimination in the justice system. They cheered as Sarah emerged from the building with Mrs. Jenkins by her side. "This is just the beginning," Sarah told the reporters. "We're not just removing one biased judge. We're changing the system that protected him for so long." Later that evening, in her office, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A young black law student named Maya Johnson knocked on her door. "Miss Thompson," Maya said, her voice full of emotion, "I watched everything today. I've been questioning whether to continue law school because of the discrimination I might face. But after seeing you today, I know I have to keep going." Sarah smiled, remembering her own struggles as a young attorney. "The system will only change if we're part of it, Maya. Remember that." As the sun set over the city, Sarah looked out her office window at the courthouse where it had all started. Judge Harrison's name was being removed from his office door, but the real victory wasn't in ending one man's career. It was in starting a movement that would reshape the entire judicial system. Mrs. Jenkins had been right that first day in court. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of injustice, and sometimes, Sarah thought, it takes just one person standing up to power to show others that change is possible. 6 months after the historic confrontation in courtroom 4B, Sarah Thompson stood at a podium in the state Supreme Court building, addressing a packed audience of legal professionals, activists, and media representatives. "Today marks not an ending, but a new beginning," she declared, gesturing to the newly installed plaque behind her that read Judicial Equity and Accountability Initiative. "In the past 6 months, we've reviewed over 3,000 cases previously handled by Judge Harrison. Of these, more than 800 have been flagged for racial due to clear evidence of bias." The audience included Mrs. Jenkins, sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Her simple housing discrimination case had sparked a revolution in the state's judicial system. Next to her sat James Carter and Maria Rodriguez, both now serving on the new Judicial Oversight Committee. Judge Harrison's resignation was just the first step, Sarah continued. Since then, 5 other judges across the state have stepped down rather than face similar investigations. But more importantly, we've implemented mandatory bias training for all judicial officials, created a transparent reporting system for discrimination complaints, and established diverse review panels for judicial appointments. In the back of the room, Maya Johnson, the law student who had visited Sarah's office months ago, took notes furiously. She was now leading a student organization dedicated to racial equality in the legal system. The numbers tell the story, Sarah said, as new statistics appeared on the screen behind her. In just 6 months, we've seen a 40% increase in successful cases presented by minority attorneys. Damage awards in discrimination cases have reached parity across racial lines. But perhaps most significantly, minority applications to law schools in our state have increased by 65%. The changes hadn't come easily. There had been resistance from the old guard, attempts to discredit the investigation, and even threats against Sarah and her team. But the evidence had been too strong, the momentum too powerful to stop. As for Parkview Properties, Sarah added, they'd become an unexpected model for change. Under their new management and policies, they've achieved the highest diversity rating in the state's rental market. Mrs. Jenkins didn't just get justice for herself, she helped create a new standard for fair housing. Mrs. Jenkins wiped away tears as the audience applauded. The property company that had once denied her an apartment was now offering scholarships for minority students studying housing law. After the presentation, Sarah met with a group of first-year law students in her office. The space had changed. The walls now held photographs of various community meetings, strategy sessions, and victory celebrations. The most prominent photo showed Sarah and Mrs. Jenkins outside the courthouse on that first day, both women standing tall despite the challenges they faced. Remember, Sarah told the students, change doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from one person refusing to accept injustice, from one voice speaking truth to power. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave her office, she received a letter. It was from Judge Harrison's daughter. Dear Ms. Thompson, it read, I wanted you to know that my father's actions forced our family to confront our own biases. Your courage in standing up to him has changed not just the legal system, but also the hearts and minds of people like me. Thank you. Sarah placed the letter in a special folder, along with dozens of similar messages she received over the months. Each one reminded her why the fight for justice mattered. As she drove home, she passed the courthouse where it had all begun. The building looked the same, but what happened inside had transformed completely. New judges, trained in bias awareness, now presided over courtrooms where merit, not race or gender, determined outcomes. Mrs. Jenkins had moved into a beautiful apartment in the building that had once rejected her. She turned her experience into activism, speaking at community meetings about the importance of standing up for one's rights. The sun was setting over the city as Sarah parked her car. She thought about all the changes that had occurred because one elderly woman refused to accept discrimination, and one attorney refused to be silenced. The work wasn't finished. It never would be, but they had proved that change was possible, one courtroom, one case, one voice at a time. The story of the black woman who faced a racist judge had become more than just a tale of personal triumph. It had become a catalyst for systemic change, a reminder that justice, while not always swift, was always worth fighting for.